Claim offer today 5:09 p.m. Pasted text 8. Text document give me a 30-image promat about this speech based on your uploaded Wild West story. Here are 30 cinematic, ultra-realistic image prompts that follow the story scene by scene. 1. The stranger arrives a starving cowboy father collapsing before a lonely Nebraska farmhouse in 1887, blazing summer sun, dusty prairie. 2-year-old boy strapped to his back, little girl in a faded pink dress holding his hand, exhausted expressions, cinematic western, ultra-realistic, dramatic lighting 8K highly detailed. Widow on the porch, a beautiful young widow, Margaret, 34 years old, standing on a weathered wooden porch, wearing a simple frontier dress, staring in shock at the starving family beneath the scorching sky, dry cornfields behind her, cinematic realism. 3. Desperate plea, the exhausted cowboy kneeling in the dirt, removing his battered cowboy hat, tears in his eyes as he begs Margaret to feed his children. Harsh sunlight, emotional western drama, ultra-detailed. 4. Entering the cabin, Margaret gently helping the weak little girl into her rustic log cabin. Warm sunlight through dusty windows, old wooden furniture, frontier atmosphere, emotional cinematic lighting. 5. Warm meal, 3 bowls of steaming vegetable stew, and thick rye bread on an old wooden table. Starving children eating desperately while their father silently watches. Rustic frontier cabin, warm golden light. 6. Father's sacrifice, Elias refusing to eat until his children finish, sitting quietly with folded hands, blue eyes full of sorrow. Flickering lantern light, emotional western realism. 7. Margaret's hidden pain, Margaret standing beside the kitchen window, remembering her late husband. Lonely expression, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, rustic cabin interior, cinematic atmosphere. 8. The promise, Elias standing beside the dry farmland promising to save Margaret's farm, dusty Nebraska plains, dry cornfields, dramatic clouds. Hopeful cinematic composition. 9. Dry well and abandoned wooden, well surrounded by cracked earth and dead crops, beneath a burning summer sky. Symbol of hopelessness, ultra-realistic western landscape. 10. Beginning the dig, Elias swinging a heavy pickaxe into hard Nebraska soil at sunrise. Sweat pouring down his face, determined expression, cinematic dust particles, ultra-realistic. 11. Endless labor, deep excavation beside the farmhouse. Elias hauling massive rocks with bleeding hands under the blazing sun, Margaret watching from a distance, dramatic western realism. 12. Caring for the children, Margaret, teaching little Mary to sew colorful quilt pieces on the farmhouse porch, while toddler Toby smiles nearby. Warm sunset lighting, peaceful frontier life. 13. Gossip in town, women in frontier dresses, whispering outside the blacksmith's shop while staring toward Margaret's farm, judgmental expressions. Old West Town Street. 14. The cruel banker, wealthy banker Mr. Miller arriving in a polished black carriage wearing an expensive black suit, laughing at Elias's unfinished well, intimidating presence. 15. Midnight doubts, Margaret sitting beside the deep excavation under moonlight, looking worried while Elias rests exhausted at the bottom of the shaft, silver moon illuminating the scene. 16. Gentle trust, Margaret carefully washing dirt and blood from Elias's rough hands beside the campfire. Quiet emotional connection, lantern glow, cinematic close-up. 17. Respect for the past, Elias respectfully handing Thomas's old carpenter square back to Margaret inside the barn. Soft emotional expressions, dusty golden sunlight. 18. Angry mob, a group of angry townsmen confronting Elias outside the farm, kicking over mortar buckets, dramatic confrontation beneath dark storm clouds, cinematic tension. 19. Dangerous fall, the rope snapping while Elias climbs from the deep well shaft, Margaret rushing toward the opening in horror, dramatic action scene. Ultra-realistic. 20. Water at last, crystal, clear water bursting from deep underground inside the stone shaft, Elias smiling with joy. Dramatic sunlight illuminating the flowing water, epic cinematic realism. 21. Celebration, Margaret crying tears of joy while embracing Elias beside the flowing well, children laughing nearby, golden evening light. Emotional Western masterpiece 22. Building the windmill. Elias constructing a giant wooden frontier windmill with handcrafted blades beside the farmhouse. Tools scattered around. Bright summer sky 3. The windmill turns. The completed wooden windmill spinning powerfully in the Nebraska wind while fresh water gushes from an iron pump. Hopeful cinematic landscape 24. Arrest County Sheriff placing iron handcuffs on Elias while Margaret and the children cry Mr. Miller smirking in the background. Dramatic emotional Western scene. 25. Lonely farm. Margaret standing alone beside the spinning windmill at sunset after Elias's arrest. Empty farmyard. Emotional loneliness. Cinematic lighting. 26. Petition for freedom. Margaret riding horseback across the Nebraska prairie, collecting signatures from neighboring farmers. Determined expression. Golden prairie landscape. 27. Jail proposal. Margaret proposing marriage to Elias through the iron bars of a frontier jail cell, while the children watch with hopeful smiles. Emotional cinematic realism. 28. Wedding behind bars. A touching Old West wedding inside a small jail. Preacher performing the ceremony. Elias and Margaret holding hands through iron bars. Lantern-lit atmosphere. 29. Freedom and reunion. Elias walking home after his release. Children running into his arms while Margaret waits on the farmhouse porch. Joyful reunion beneath a blue prairie sky. 30. Blizzard survival. The family huddled together inside the cozy log cabin during the Great Blizzard of 1888, roaring fireplace, heavy quilts, snowstorm raging outside the windows, warm cinematic ending, ultra-realistic 8K. Meal chat GPT, vood a fabric wa thin fin from years of hard labor. In prens barksins. Image prompt. YouTube. Kathirs fabrin thin from years of har. Thumbnail. Prompt saken. Prompt. Thumbnail. Thumbnail. Weber. Here are 5 high CTR YouTube thumbnail prompts based on your Wild West story. These are designed for AI image generators like Midjourney, Flux GPT Image, or Leonardo AI. Thumbnail prompt. Once a best for high CTR prompt. A desperate handsome cowboy father on his knees, holding out his hands, while 2 starving children stand beside him. A beautiful wealthy widow, in a blue frontier dress, standing on the wooden porch with tears in her eyes. Dry Nebraska prairie. Dramatic golden sunset. Emotional expressions. Cinematic Western movie poster. Ultra-realistic faces. Intense eye contact. Dramatic lighting, dust particles, shallow depth of field. Masterpiece 8K HDR, no blur, highly detailed. Text on thumbnail, Hagu Sparpofgala, Seichi Kanji Tir Live VC bold yellow and white cinematic font with black outline. Thumbnail prompt 2 prompt. Beautiful frontier widow, opening her farmhouse door to a starving cowboy carrying a small boy on his back, while a little girl holds his hand. Emotional faces. Dusty Nebraska farm, dramatic sunlight, cinematic Western romance, realistic skin texture, movie quality composition, ultra detailed. 8K textile VAITHI thumbnail prompt 3 prompt. Cowboy father in chains being taken away by a sheriff, while a crying widow reaches toward him, and 2 frightened children hug her dress. Spinning wooden windmill in the background. Emotional Western drama, ultra-realistic, cinematic lighting, masterpiece HDR. Text e suvd farm. Tichilosti evyrYthng. Thumbnail prompt 4 prompt. Cowboy hugging a beautiful widow beside a newly discovered flowing water well. Children celebrating. Dramatic sunset, powerful emotions. Old West romance, movie poster style. Ultra-realistic faces. Golden cinematic lighting. 8K highly detailed. Text. Stars o energy faal. Thumbnail prompt 5 some most clickable, prompty split screen cinematic thumbnail. Left side. Starving cowboy father kneeling in the dust with 2 hungry children under a blazing sun. Right side. Beautiful widow embracing the cowboy in front of a thriving farmhouse with a spinning windmill. and flowing water. Strong contrast between despair and hope. Dramatic Western movie poster, emotional facial expressions, photorealistic, ultra-realistic, HDR, 8K. Masterpiece, vivid colors, perfect YouTube thumbnail composition, high contrast. Text: Ace Tiranjar Burji Faur. Ashar Aac Hare Shuharaj, bold yellow and white text with black outline, shocked emotional faces, designed for maximum YouTube CTR. These prompts match your story and are optimized to create eye-catching thumbnails that emphasize emotion, contrast, and curiosity, elements that tend to perform well for Wild West storytelling videos. 1887, Music, Nebraska. The stranger collapsed before he reached Margaret's porch. A 2-year-old boy clung weakly to his back, while a little girl in a faded pink dress held his hand. The man had not eaten in 3 days. Yet, he did not ask for food for himself. He removed his battered hat, sank to his knees, and looked up at the lonely widow. "Please," he whispered, "I beg you, feed my children." Margaret stared at the 3 exhausted figures beneath the merciless summer sun. She was 34 years old, widowed, and only weeks away from losing the farm she and her late husband had built together. Nebraska was dying beneath the sky that had forgotten the color of rain. The corn was yellow, the cattle were thin, and the bank was waiting for Margaret to fail. But as she looked at the starving children, Margaret understood one thing clearly: whatever little food remained in her cabin would belong to them that night. Then she looked more closely at the stranger's face. It was marked by exhaustion and a sorrow too old for words. His hair was dark, matted, and thick with grime. His skin had been darkened by weeks beneath the relentless sun. But his eyes were a startling, piercing blue. They were haunting. They were the eyes of a man who had watched his entire world burn to ash. He looked at the little girl shivering beside him. Her face was pale beneath a thick layer of prairie dust. Her lips were white and cracked. They were bleeding from the dryness. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, the man whispered. "That doesn't matter to me. I can endure the hunger, but they are fading. I am watching them die before my eyes." He bowed his head low to the ground. His exhausted shoulders shook with silent sobs. Margaret did not hesitate for a single second. The rules of the frontier were simple and sacred. You did not turn away the starving. You did not close your door to the lost. She stepped off the porch. The heat radiated off the ground in waves. It burned through her thin, worn soles. She reached out a hand toward the stranger. The man flinched at her movement. He looked like a stray dog that expected a blow instead of a touch. "Come inside, Massa," Margaret said. Her voice was soft but firm. "The sun is no friend to the weary." She gently helped the little girl up the wooden stairs. The child's hand felt like a bundle of dry twigs. The man forced himself to stand. His long legs trembled violently with the effort. He followed her into the cool shadows of the cabin. The room smelled of dried summer herbs and old wood. It was a humble, tiny space, but it was a sanctuary. Margaret pointed to a sturdy wooden bench. "Sit," she commanded. She went immediately to the cast-iron stove. She had a small pot of vegetable stew left. It was mostly clear broth and shriveled potatoes, but it was warm. It was life in a bowl. She poured the liquid into 3 mismatched ceramic bowls. She set them on the table with 2 thick slices of rye bread. The children began to eat. Their desperation was painful to witness. They didn't speak. They didn't look up. They focused only on the life, giving warmth of the food. The man sat perfectly still. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. He watched his children with an intensity that made Margaret's chest ache. He didn't touch his own bowl. "Eat." Mr. Margaret paused, waiting for a name. "Elias," he finally said. "Elias Thorne." "Eat your soup, Mr. Thorne," Margaret insisted. He shook his head slowly. His eyes never left the small faces of the children. Let them finish every drop first. There might not be enough for their next meal tomorrow. Margaret felt a hard, painful lump in her throat. This man was prepared to starve so they could live one more day. I have more in the pot. I promise. She lied. She leaned against the rough wooden counter. Her heart ached with a sudden sharp empathy. She thought of Thomas. Thomas had died 2 years ago. A relentless fever had swept through the valley like a plague. It was like a scythe cutting through ripe wheat. Now she was a widow at 34. She was holding on to her homestead with nothing but raw grit. Elias finally took a hesitant, trembling spoonful. He closed his eyes as he swallowed the warmth. A single salt-streaked tear escaped his eye. It ran through the thick dust on his hollow cheek. He looked up and locked eyes with Margaret. "I have no silver to pay you for this kindness," he said. "I didn't ask for silver," she replied softly, "and I don't want any." He stood up, even in his ragged clothes. He carried himself with quiet dignity. He walked to the small, dusty window. He looked out at the parched, dying fields of her farm. He studied the ranch with the practiced eye of a master well driller. "You are losing this place, aren't you?" he asked. Margaret stiffened. Her pride flared up like a sudden flame. "I am managing just fine on my own. The bank says otherwise," he countered softly. "I saw your name on the foreclosure notice outside the bank. I worked near a cattle camp east of here last spring," Elias explained. "The surveyors were already marking a new route through this valley." Margaret turned away. Her throat felt tight and constricted. It was the bitter, undeniable truth. She was months behind on her mortgage payments. The town banker, Mr. Miller, was a cold and calculating man. He was waiting for her to fail. Miller had been waiting for the drought to leave her too desperate to resist him. Elias turned back to her. His blue eyes burned with a new fierce light. "You saved the lives of my children today. You gave us the last of what you had in your pantry. I make you a solemn, unbreakable promise. Margaret, feed my children for the rest of this summer. Give them a roof so they don't have to sleep in the dirt, and I will save your farm from the bank." Margaret looked at him for a long silent time. "Mr. Miller doesn't want this land because it's worthless." Elias continued. "He wants it because he knows the new cattle trail will pass close to this property. Without water, you'll lose everything to him. But with water, this ranch becomes priceless." Margaret looked at her old wooden well. It was bone dry. The corn in the field was yellow and stunted. "I am a master stonemason and a well driller," Elias said. "I know the secrets the earth hides beneath the dust. The bank thinks the water in this county is gone forever. But I can find a deep vein of water, one this drought has not yet touched. I can build you a windmill that will never stop turning." Margaret looked at the sleeping boy on the bench. She looked at the girl in the faded pink dress. She knew she had no other choice. "Stay," she said. The word hung heavily in the silence. "I have an abandoned tool shed behind the house. It's dry and it's safe from the wind." Elias nodded once. The pact was sealed in the silence of the room. "I will start digging at first light." That night, Margaret carried a thin mattress and 2 folded blankets to the tool shed. Elias tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "Your children need their father strong," she said. "That means you must sleep and eat as well." He lowered his eyes, unused to being included in anyone's concern. Mary stood in the doorway holding a small piece of bread she had saved from supper. She broke it in half and offered one piece to him. "You said we eat first," she whispered. "Tonight you eat with us." Elias accepted it with both hands as though the child had placed something sacred in his palms. Later, Margaret watched from the porch as he tucked the blankets around Toby and Mary. He remained beside them until their breathing became slow and peaceful. Only then did he sit against the wall of the shed and close his eyes. Margaret realized he had probably spent every night on the trail awake, listening for danger and fearing that one of his children might not survive until morning. Before returning to the cabin, she left a cup of water beside him. Elias opened his eyes and saw it. Neither of them spoke, but in that silent exchange, the first fragile thread of trust was drawn between them. The next few weeks were a frantic blur of labor. Margaret woke every morning at 4. The sky was still purple and bruised. She boiled water for coffee. She baked bread in the heavy iron oven. She watched Elias from the kitchen window. He was a man of very few words. He spent his days in the blistering gun. White-hot sun. He dug a deep, dark hole behind the house. At first it looked like a grave. Then he began to build. He gathered heavy flat stones from a creek bed miles away. He hauled them on his broad back. His muscles strained beneath the weight. He worked until his hands bled and the skin peeled. The sun darkened his skin and hardened his hands. That night, Margaret sat on the porch. She mended his frayed, sweat-stained shirts by lamplight. The fabric was so thin, it was almost transparent. She used her best silk thread for the seams. It was a silent sacrifice of her own. She watched the children begin to heal under her care. After weeks of food and rest, 2-year-old Toby began walking steadily again. Mary, the girl in pink, helped Margaret in the garden. Margaret taught Mary how to sew with a needle. They worked together on a 9-patch quilt block. The children loved the bright, colorful scraps of fabric. They sat together on the weathered porch steps. The smell of dried lavender filled the evening air. "My mother had a quilt just like this one," Mary whispered. "She died on the trail coming west." Margaret felt a sharp, stabbing pang of grief. She pulled the small, fragile girl closer to her side. "Then we shall make this one even better," Margaret said. "Every stitch we make is a memory kept alive." The townspeople began to whisper in the shadows. Gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire in July. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, stopped by one afternoon. She looked at Elias with pure disdain. He was covered in thick mud and salty sweat. "It isn't proper, Margaret," she hissed through her teeth. "A widow housing a man with no references, no property, and no known history. The children were starving to death." "Sarah," Margaret replied, "is it proper to let children die in the dirt?" Mrs. Gable drove away in a huff of dust, but the seeds of a scandal were already sown in the dry soil. A few days later, Mr. Miller arrived. He came in a polished black carriage. He wore a suit that cost more than Margaret's entire house. He looked down into the deep, dark pit Elias had dug. He threw back his head and laughed a cold, cruel laugh. "You're digging for ghosts, Thorne. This entire county is a dead dust bowl. Your overdue mortgage payments must be made within 1 month, Margaret. On that day, I expect the keys to this house or the cash." Elias didn't even look up at the man. He kept swinging his heavy iron pickaxe. The sound of metal striking stone echoed across the plains. Clink, clink, clink. It was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the farm. Cold fear swept through Margaret. What if Elias was wrong? What if there was no water down there that evening? She walked to the edge of the deep pit. Elias was sitting at the very bottom. The moon was silver, cold and indifferent. "Are you all right?" she called down into the dark. He slowly looked up. His face was hollowed out by the shadows. "The stone down here is harder than I thought. But I can feel the change in the air. The earth is getting cold and heavy beneath my feet. The water's close, Margaret. I can feel it calling to the surface." He climbed out, his movement stiff and pained. Margaret sat down on the grass beside him. She handed him a cool, damp cloth for his face. Their fingers brushed together for a fleeting second. It was an unexpected electric spark. Margaret gently washed the grit from his callous palms. He stayed perfectly silent, watching her. "Why are you doing this for me?" he asked softly. "The whole town hates you for letting a stranger stay." Margaret looked up at the infinite cold stars. "I know what it's like to be completely alone. Elias, my husband, and I built this house with our bare hands. I won't let a man in a silk suit take my soul away." Elias closed his hand firmly around hers. "I will not let him take a single inch of your land. I promise you that on my very life." The bond between them shifted in that moment. It was no longer just a business bargain. It was a sacred partnership of two broken souls. Over the days that followed, Margaret noticed the quiet ways Elias respected the life she had built with Thomas. He never entered the cabin after dark unless she invited him. He asked permission before touching the tools hanging in the barn, even when he desperately needed them. One evening, while searching for a measuring line, he found Thomas's old carpenter's square wrapped in cloth. Elias carried it directly to Margaret instead of using it. "Some tools belong to a man's memory," he said. "I won't take that from you." Margaret ran her thumb along the worn wooden edge. Thomas's initials were still carved into one corner. For a moment, grief rose inside her, so sharply that she could not speak. Elias did not reach for her. He simply stood nearby and allowed her the dignity of her sorrow. At last, Margaret placed the square in his hands. Thomas believed tools were meant to build something that would outlive the person holding them. She said, "Use it for the windmill." Elias looked down at the square, then back at her. "I will treat it as if you were standing beside me." That night, Margaret understood that trusting Elias did not mean betraying the husband she had lost. Perhaps Thomas's memory was not a locked door. Perhaps it was a lantern showing her the way forward. If you believe kindness can give a broken family another chance, subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The next week, Margaret spent her last few pennies on sugar. She made wild plum jam for the children. The kitchen smelled sweet, tart, and like home. She watched Mary lick the wooden spoon. The girl's cheeks were finally turning a healthy pink. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, but the tension in this town was growing like a storm. A group of angry men came by the farm. They were led by Mr. Miller's young, arrogant nephew. They accused Elias of stealing a horse from the livery. It was an obvious lie meant to drive him away. They tried to provoke him into a violent fight. They kicked over his precious buckets of mortar. Elias stood his ground like an ancient immovable oak tree. "Leave this land right now," he growled. The men saw the cold iron in his blue gaze. They left Bopos, but they promised to return with the law. Margaret was trembling as she watched them go. "They won't stop until they destroy us. Elias, they want you gone." "Let them try," he replied with a grim smile. He went straight back into the pit. He worked through the night by the flickering light of an oil lantern. By mid-August, the heat was absolutely unbearable. The grass crunched like broken glass underfoot. The town's main well was running dangerously low. But Elias was still digging deeper. He was over 20 feet down into the bedrock now. He had built a wooden derrick to haul up the heavy stone. Margaret helped him every single day. Her muscles ached and burned with the effort. She pulled the heavy ropes until her shoulders screamed as she believed in him, with a ferocity that frightened her. That evening, the rope snapped while Elias was climbing from the shaft. Margaret heard the sharp crack and dropped to her knees beside the opening. For several terrible seconds, but there was only silence. Then Elias called up from the darkness. He had caught one of the timber braces before falling far, but his shoulder had struck the stone wall. Margaret lowered another rope and helped pull him to the surface. His face was pale with pain, and one arm hung stiffly at his side. "The digging stops," she said. "At least until you can lift that arm again." Elias looked toward the dry cornfield. "Miller will be here in less than 2 weeks, and your children need a living father more than I need this land." Margaret answered. The firmness of her words silenced him. She bound his shoulder with clean cloth and made him rest beside the cabin. Before dawn, Margaret woke to the sound of a pickaxe. Elias was back beside the shaft. using his good arm to clear loose stone from the opening. Furious and frightened, she hurried across the yard and confronted him beside the shaft. "You made a promise to save this farm," she said, "but I never asked you to bury yourself beneath it." Elias rested his forehead against the handle of the pickaxe. "If I fail, my children lose another home." Margaret took hold of his uninjured hand. "Then we will not fail alone." 2 difficult days later, as Elias's injured shoulder slowly began to improve, Margaret heard a sudden, piercing shout from the shaft. It was a sound of pure joy. She ran to the edge of the pit. Elias stood near the bottom of the shaft, one hand gripping the ladder. A silver stream of water seeped through a crack in the rock and spread across his boots. He struck the stone once more. The stream widened cold and clear. "Margaret," he yelled at the top of his lungs, "look at the life coming out of the ground." The water began gathering in the stone basin beneath him. It was a miracle in the middle of a wasteland. She began to laugh, tears streaming down her dusty face. "You did it, Elias. You actually did it." Elias climbed up the ladder with newfound energy. He grabbed Margaret and swung her around in a circle. For one glorious moment, the world disappeared. The debt, the drought, and the gossip vanished. There was only the sound of rushing water. He set her down gently, his hands on her waist. His face was inches from hers. His blue eyes searched her soul for an answer. "We need to build the tower now," he said. "We must finish it before Miller comes back." They worked feverishly for the next 6 days. Elias used seasoned wood. He salvaged from the old shed. He crafted the giant blades with the precision of an artist. He was a master with a heavy axe. The children cheered as the wooden fan finally turned. The hot prairie wind caught the blades. Creak. Whoosh, creak! The iron pump began to clank and groan. A torrent of water gushed from the iron spout. It was sweet, cold, and pure. That evening they celebrated like royalty. Margaret cooked a whole chicken she had been saving. They finally had a future worth dreaming about, but a dark looming figure appeared in the doorway. It was Mr. Miller. The county sheriff was standing right behind him. "Who gave you the right to draw water from this land?" Miller demanded. "This is a legal functioning well, Mr. Miller," Margaret said. "Soon, I will have enough to clear the overdue mortgage payments and stop the foreclosure. I'll be selling water to every neighbor in the valley." Miller's face turned a deep, bruised purple. "This man is a fugitive from justice." Miller spat. "Elias Thorne is wanted for stealing a horse and wagon from a freight company near Kearney." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked at Elias, searching his face for the truth. He did not deny the charge. "My wife was dying," Elias said quietly. "My children had gone 2 days without food, and a winter storm was closing the road. The freight agent near Kearney refused to help us, so I took 1 horse and a wagon. I meant to return them, but my wife died before we reached the next town. After I buried her, keeping the children alive was the only thing that mattered." The sheriff looked deeply conflicted. "I'm sorry, Elias." The sheriff said quietly, "But I have a warrant and I have to take you into custody." Margaret stepped boldly in front of Elias. "No," she cried out. "He saved this farm and he saved these children." Elias put a gentle hand on her trembling shoulder. "It's all right, Margaret. I kept my promise to you. The well is yours. The land is safe. Please." His voice broke. "Just look after my children." The sheriff led Elias away in heavy iron handcuffs. Toby reached for his father until the sheriff led Elias beyond the doorway. Mary buried her face in Margaret's skirt and sobbed his name. Miller smirked as he followed them to the carriage. "You're still just a woman alone, Margaret. Water or no water, you won't last the winter." The house felt echoing and empty without him. The sound of the windmill was a constant reminder of his work. Neighbors came from miles around, desperate for water. They paid in silver coins and sacks of flour. Within 2 weeks, Margaret had collected enough to clear the overdue mortgage payments and stopped the foreclosure. She rode into town and placed the final coins firmly on Miller's mahogany desk. But she didn't feel like a winner. She felt hollow and broken inside. She visited the jail cell every single day. "The children miss you," she told him through the bars. "And I miss you too, Elias." He touched her cheek through the iron. "Go home, Margaret. You don't owe me anything more. You owe me everything," she whispered back. She went to a sharp lawyer named Mr. Henderson. "Is there any way to help him stay?" she begged. Henderson looked over his heavy law books. "Horse theft is a serious charge," Henderson said. "But Elias has never been convicted, and the circumstances matter. If the community petitions the governor, and the freight company confirms that no one was harmed, we may be able to win clemency." Margaret leaned closer. "How do we prove that he is no longer a drifter?" Henderson studied her for a long moment. "By showing that he has a permanent home, a family, and the support of this valley." Margaret lowered her eyes. She already knew that what she felt for Elias had grown far beyond gratitude. Margaret spent the next 48 hours on her horse. She rode to every farm she had shared her water with. She told them the absolute truth about Elias Thorne. She told them about the father who chose his babies over a gun. The people of Nebraska signed her petition in droves. They knew a man of true character when they saw one. Mr. Henderson also sent a telegram to the freight office near Kearney. 3 days later, a reply arrived from the company's aging manager. The stolen horse had returned to the freight yard on its own shortly after Elias fled, still harnessed to the empty wagon. Nothing had been permanently lost, and no one had been injured. The manager admitted that his former agent had refused shelter to Elias's sick wife during the storm. Henderson placed the telegram beside the community petition. "This does not erase what Elias did," he told Margaret, "but it proves he was not a thief seeking profit. He was a desperate husband trying to save his family." Margaret carried a copy of the telegram to the jail. Elias read it twice before lowering the paper. "All these years," he whispered, "I believe that horse had died on the road because of me." Margaret reached through the bars and closed her hand around his. "You have carried enough guilt, Elias. Let the truth carry some of the weight now." For the first time since his arrest, hope returned to his eyes. The following morning, Margaret returned to the jail with the children. Mary was holding the finished 9-patch quilt. "Elias Thorne," Margaret said, standing before his cell. "You saved my farm. But that is not why I came. You gave this house hope again. You gave me a family I thought I had lost forever." She drew a trembling breath. "Marry me, Elias, not because the law expects it, but because I want you to come home to us." Elias stared at her through the iron bars, unable to speak. Then his eyes filled with tears. "I came to your door with nothing but 2 hungry children, and the fear that I had failed their mother," he whispered. "You gave us food, dignity, and a home." He reached for Margaret's hands. "Yes, if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life deserving you." The preacher came to the dark iron cell. It wasn't a romantic setting for a wedding, but the room felt sacred and holy. They exchanged their vows in the presence of the children. Elias reached through the bars and cupped her face in his hands. Margaret leaned forward, and they shared a brief, trembling kiss between the iron rails. It was a promise of a future they both deserved. The petition was sent directly to the governor. Elias was a local hero to the farmers. Several anxious weeks passed while Margaret waited for an answer. After reviewing the petition, the company manager's sworn statement, and the testimony of the local farmers, the governor granted Elias clemency and ordered his release. The day Elias was released on the windmill was spinning fast. Elias walked up the dusty trail to the house. Margaret was waiting on the porch, her heart racing. The children ran to him with screams of joy. He picked them up, his eyes wet with hot tears. "I'm finally home," he whispered into Margaret's hair. "You are home," she replied. The following winter brought the great blizzard of 1888. History calls it the school children's blizzard. January 12th started strangely warm. Then the sky turned into a wall of white ice in minutes. The temperature seemed to plunge within a single terrifying hour. Margaret and Elias were trapped inside for 3 long days. The wind howled like a wounded, dying beast. The old cabin groaned beneath the weight of the snow. They huddled together under their heavy quilts. They had water from the deep well and enough firewood to survive the storm. In the terrifying darkness of the storm, Elias held her tight. "I used to think the world was only stone and dust," he whispered. "Close,